On the 15th of April, 1814, the London season opened with characteristic splendour, and Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of Lady Ashford's garden party, feeling precisely as visible as the pale grey stones beneath her feet. The afternoon sun blazed with unseasonable warmth, coaxing beads of perspiration from foreheads hastily dabbed with embroidered handkerchiefs, and Eleanor found herself retreating once more to her customary position near the hedgerow where climbing roses had not yet bloomed, but promised eventual beauty she would not be present to witness. 3 years had passed since her near ruin, 3 years of carefully cultivated invisibility, 3 years of wearing dove-grey gowns that announced nothing and attracted no one. And she had learned that survival in this glittering world required the discipline of a ghost. Her aunt, Lady Harriet Whitmore, circulated among the guests with the practiced ease of a woman who had never known what it meant to be overlooked, leaving Eleanor to her solitary observation of a society that had rendered its verdict upon her long ago. She was 26 years old, unmarried, plain-featured according to the charitable, and unfortunately ordinary according to the rest, and she had made her peace with the narrow corridor her life would occupy henceforth. The laughter of young debutantes floated across the manicured lawn like bells announcing a celebration to which she had not been invited, and Eleanor felt the familiar numbness settle into her chest where hope had once resided before she had learned better. Near the refreshment table, a cluster of matrons exchanged whispers behind painted fans, and though Eleanor could not hear their words, she recognized the sideways glances, the quick assessments, the dismissals rendered in a single flick of the eyes. She was the poor relation, the spinster companion, the cautionary tale mothers told daughters about the perils of trusting charming gentlemen with empty promises, though of course no one spoke of it directly anymore. Mrs. Frances Langley, arbiter of all gossip worth repeating, held court beneath a parasol of French lace, and Eleanor watched her lips move with the mechanical efficiency of a woman dispensing information as others dispensed currency. The words drifted toward her in fragments, carried on the warm spring breeze. Something about a return, someone of consequence. A duke who had been abroad these 5 years and was now restored to society with fortune intact and temperament reportedly unchanged. The Duke of Somerton, someone murmured, with the particular reverence reserved for unmarried gentlemen of exceptional wealth. Cold as a Scottish winter, someone else replied, but oh, what one might endure for 30,000 a year. Eleanor turned away from the gossip, fixing her attention on a butterfly navigating the garden with more freedom than she would ever possess, and reminded herself that dukes and their romantic prospects belonged to a world she had ceased to inhabit the moment Marcus Chamberlain had left her standing alone in a darkened conservatory, with her reputation in tatters. Tonight her aunt hosted a ball, and Eleanor would stand against another wall in another grey gown, and she would survive as she always did, by wanting nothing at all. The hours between the garden party and her aunt's ball passed in the peculiar haze that accompanied all social obligations Eleanor was required to attend, a blur of preparation and positioning that left her standing once again at the periphery of celebration as the clock struck 9 in the evening, and Lady Whitmore's townhouse blazed with candlelight that touched everyone but her. The ballroom swelled with music and movement, silks rustling against silks, the murmur of conversation punctuated by crystalline laughter, and Eleanor endured precisely 47 minutes of smiling at no one, and being smiled at by fewer before she slipped away with the practiced stealth of a woman who had long ago learned that her absence was never noted. The library called to her as it always did, that sanctuary of leather and silence tucked at the far end of the east corridor, where the sounds of the ball became a distant pulse rather than an overwhelming roar, and she moved through the shadowed hallway with relief, loosening the tension in her shoulders. She did not bother with more than a single candle, preferring the dimness that matched her mood, and she had already selected a volume of poetry from the shelf nearest the window when a voice emerged from the depths of a wing-back chair she had assumed empty. "I had wondered how long the ballroom would hold you," the voice said, low and measured with an accent that spoke of education and perhaps something else. something foreign, and Eleanor startled so violently that the book tumbled from her fingers to land with an accusing thump upon the carpet. A figure unfolded from the chair, tall and broad-shouldered, features emerging from shadow into the candlelight to reveal dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble for all its expression revealed, and Eleanor recognized him instantly from the whispered descriptions that had circulated through the garden party that afternoon. The Duke of Somerton stood before her in immaculate evening dress, and his eyes, grey as winter storms, studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though she had been catalogued and filed away for future reference. "Forgive me," she managed, her voice steadier than her pulse. "I did not realize the room was occupied." His head tilted slightly, a gesture of assessment rather than dismissal. "Nor did I expect company," he replied, "though I find I do not object to the particular company that has arrived," and something in his tone suggested that the observation surprised him as much as it did her. Eleanor bent to retrieve her fallen book, using the motion to compose herself, and when she straightened, she found that he had not moved, had not looked. Away had not performed any of the social retreats that gentlemen typically employed when confronted with spinsters of no consequence. "You prefer poetry to dancing," he observed, and it was not a question. "I prefer solitude to scrutiny, Your Grace," she answered before she could think better of such honesty, and for one terrible moment she thought she had offended him, but then his lips curved in what might generously be called the ghost of a smile. "As do I, Miss Ashworth," he said, and though she could not fathom how he knew her name, she found herself wondering, for the first time in 3 years, what it might mean to be remembered. "And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. The morning of April the 16th arrived dressed in clouds that promised rain before noon, and Eleanor sat in her aunt's morning room at precisely 10 o'clock, wearing a plain muslin dress of unremarkable brown and pretending to read correspondence that held not a fraction of her attention. Lady Harriet Whitmore occupied her customary chair near the window where the light best served her endless letter-writing, her quill scratching against parchment with the industry of a woman who considered social connections a form of currency to be carefully accumulated and strategically spent. Eleanor had slept poorly, her dreams haunted by grey eyes and a voice that had spoken her name as though it were worth remembering, and she had woken before dawn to ruthlessly remind herself that such foolishness led only to disappointment. The Duke of Somerton had been making conversation, nothing more, the sort of idle exchange that gentlemen of his station performed without thought or consequence, and she would do well to forget the entire encounter before hope took root in soil she had long ago salted against its growth. "You were absent from the ballroom for quite some time last evening," her aunt observed, without looking up from her letter, and Eleanor felt the familiar prickle of scrutiny that accompanied all of Lady Harriet's seemingly casual remarks. "I found the library," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Did you know," her aunt continued, as though Eleanor had not spoken, "that I was acquainted with the Duchess of Somerton before her passing, and that I corresponded with her regularly during the late Duke's illness?" Eleanor set down her own correspondence with hands that remained admirably steady. "I did not," she said. "The current Duke," Lady Harriet pressed on, "has been abroad these 5 years, attending to business interests and, if the rumours hold any truth, nursing wounds of a more personal nature, though no one has ever confirmed the particulars." Eleanor said nothing, though her pulse had begun to beat in a rhythm that felt suspiciously like interest. "He is unmarried," her aunt added with the precision of a woman who had catalogued every eligible gentleman in England by fortune and temperament, possessed of 3,000 a year and an estate in Derbyshire that is considered among the finest in the country. The rain began then, drops striking the window with increasing insistence, and Eleanor watched them trace paths down the glass, like tears she refused to shed. "Aunt," she said quietly, "I am 26 years old, and we both know that my circumstances preclude any interest from gentlemen of consequence." Lady Harriet finally looked up, and something in her expression shifted from calculation to a softer emotion Eleanor could not quite name. "You are my niece," she said, "and I have failed you once by not protecting you from that viper chamberlain, but I will not fail you again by allowing you to surrender before any battle has been fought." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest that there was no battle, that hope was a luxury she could not afford, that the Duke of Somerton had merely been polite to a stranger in a library. But the words died unspoken as the rain intensified, and she wondered, despite every lesson the past had taught her, whether her aunt might possibly be right. The rain that had begun 2 days prior showed no signs of relenting on the afternoon of April 18th, and Eleanor found herself standing in the hushed galleries of the British Museum at precisely 3 o'clock, having accompanied her aunt on an errand that Lady Harriet had abandoned within 20 minutes in favour of visiting an old acquaintance whose townhouse sat conveniently nearby. Eleanor had not minded being left among the antiquities and paintings, for solitude in public spaces offered a particular comfort that solitude in drawing-rooms could not match, and she had drifted through the galleries with the unhurried pace of a woman who expected nothing from the day, and therefore could not be disappointed by it. She was studying a pastoral landscape, all soft greens and golden light depicting a countryside that seemed to exist only in the imagination of artists, when a familiar voice spoke from somewhere to her left. "You find something troubling in pastoral contentment, Miss Ashworth," and the observation landed with such precision that Eleanor turned to find the Duke of Somerton standing 3 feet away, his dark coat beaded with rain from the streets outside, his grey eyes fixed upon her face with that same cataloguing intensity she remembered from the library. "Your Grace," she managed, and she hated how breathless the words emerged, hated more how her heart had begun to beat in a rhythm that felt entirely beyond her control. "I did not expect to find you here. Nor I you," he replied, though something in his expression suggested this was not entirely truthful, and he moved to stand beside her before the painting, close enough that she could smell rain and something else, sandalwood perhaps, or cedar, something warm beneath the dampness. Yet here we both are, seeking refuge from weather that seems determined to drown all of London. Eleanor turned back to the painting because looking at him had become suddenly difficult, and she fixed her gaze upon the shepherdess in the foreground, who seemed blissfully unaware of how fortunate she was to exist in oils rather than flesh. "I was thinking," Eleanor said before she could stop herself, "that the artist has never known true pastoral life, for there is no mud, no illness among the sheep, no suggestion that the shepherdess has ever been cold or hungry or lonely." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when Eleanor finally risked a glance at him, she found he was looking at her rather than the painting, and something in his expression had shifted from assessment to what might have been recognition. "You see through the pretty falsehood to the truth beneath," he said quietly, "and I find that rather remarkable in a world that seems to prefer the falsehood." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked down at her gloved hands, noting with familiar shame the careful mending at the seam of her left thumb that marked her as a woman of limited means. "It is not a particularly useful talent, Your Grace," she replied. "On the contrary, Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice had softened in a way that made her breath catch. "I believe it may be the most useful talent of all," and when she looked up again, he was almost smiling, and Eleanor forgot, for one dangerous moment, all the reasons she had taught herself not to hope. Lady Somerset's musicale, on the evening of April 22nd, had drawn the finest of London society to her gilded music room, and Eleanor sat in a chair near the back where she had positioned herself with the strategic precision of a woman who had learned that invisibility was its own form of armor. Her aunt had insisted upon the pale blue gown, a borrowed confection of silk that felt foreign against Eleanor's skin after years of greys and browns, and she had submitted to the transformation with the weary resignation of one who knew that no amount of fine fabric could alter the fundamental truth of her plainness. The Mozart sonata filled the room with notes that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight, and Eleanor allowed herself to be carried by the music into a space where she did not have to think about the Duke of Somerton or the way her heart had begun to betray her with hope she could not afford. She had not seen him since the museum 4 days prior, had told herself firmly that their encounters were coincidence and nothing more, that a man of his consequence would have forgotten her name by now and moved on to worthier pursuits. Then she felt the air shift beside her and knew, without turning, that he had found her again. "Miss Ashworth," Frederick said quietly as he settled into the empty chair at her side, a chair that had remained empty because no one sought Eleanor's company at such gatherings, and she turned to find him watching her with those grey eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. "Your Grace," she replied, and her voice emerged steadier than she had any right to expect. "I did not anticipate finding you in the back rows when the front offers superior acoustics." "I find the front rows offer superior scrutiny," he said, and something that might have been humour flickered at the corner of his mouth, "and I have had quite enough of being scrutinized for one lifetime." Across the room, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Georgiana Sinclair, resplendent in ivory silk and pearls. Her golden beauty luminous in the candlelight, turning to observe them with an expression of barely concealed incredulity. Near Georgiana, a gentleman Eleanor did not recognize, leaned close to whisper something that made both of them laugh in a manner that felt pointed and cruel. Frederick followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned back to Eleanor with deliberate attention. "My friend Greville tells me you have read Wordsworth," he said, as though they were the only two people in the room. "I should like to hear your thoughts on whether his romanticism of nature reflects genuine understanding or merely fashionable sentiment." Eleanor felt the whispers gathering around them like storm clouds, felt the weight of society's attention pressing against her borrowed silk, but Frederick's eyes held hers with such steady interest that she found herself answering despite her better judgment. The music swelled around them as Eleanor spoke of poetry and truth and the landscapes of the heart, and she tried not to think about what she had overheard Mrs. Langley say to Lady Sinclair as she passed the refreshment table, that the Duke of Somerton seemed determined to waste his attentions on the Whitmore spinster, and that Marcus Chamberlain was expected to return to London within the fortnight. The morning of April 25th dawned bright and clear, the rain that had plagued London for nearly a week finally retreating to reveal a sky of such crystalline blue that even Eleanor's carefully maintained pessimism could not entirely resist its influence, and she found herself walking beside the Duke of Somerton along the Serpentine path in Hyde Park at precisely 11 o'clock, her practical unadorned bonnet shielding her face from the spring sunshine while her heart beat with a rhythm she had forbidden it to learn. Frederick's horse waited with a groom some distance behind them, a magnificent black creature that had drawn admiring glances from every passer-by, though Frederick himself seemed entirely indifferent to the attention as he matched his stride to Eleanor's slower pace, with an ease that suggested he had done so many times before. The flowers were blooming along the path, daffodils and early tulips nodding in the gentle breeze, and Eleanor tried to focus on their cheerful colours rather than on the warmth that spread through her chest each time Frederick's sleeve brushed against hers. "You have been a companion to your aunt for how long?" he asked, and the question was delivered with such casual interest that Eleanor almost believed it to be mere conversation, though she had begun to suspect that nothing about the Duke of Somerton was ever casual or unconsidered. 3 years, she replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral, "since my father's death left me without income or prospects, and I am fortunate that Lady Harriet had need of companionship and was willing to offer me a home." Frederick was silent for a moment, and when Eleanor glanced at him, she found his jaw had tightened in that way she was coming to recognize as suppressed emotion. Fortune seems an inadequate word for circumstances that require a woman of your intelligence and perception to serve as decoration in another's household, he said quietly, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the anger she heard beneath his measured tone, anger that seemed directed not at her, but at a world that had placed her in such a position. She did not know how to respond to such unexpected advocacy, so she deflected as she had learned to do. "You spent 5 years abroad," she said, "and I confess curiosity about what drew you away from England for so long." Frederick's expression shifted, something shadowed passing behind his grey eyes before he answered. "My father was not an easy man," he said slowly, "and after his death I found I could not breathe within the walls of the estate that held so many difficult memories. So I travelled, seeking something I could not name until I realized I was searching for a reason to return." "And did you find it?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself, and Frederick turned to look at her with an intensity that made her knees feel suddenly unreliable. And when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I believe, Miss Ashworth, that I am beginning to," and Eleanor felt hope bloom in her chest like the spring flowers around them, terrifying and beautiful and impossible to uproot, no matter how firmly she told herself that such feelings would only lead to pain. Lord Harcourt's ball on the evening of April 28th blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above the assembled guests. And Eleanor stood near the terrace doors in her borrowed cream gown, feeling the weight of every whispered glance that slid across her skin like the touch of something unclean. The orchestra played a waltz that swelled and retreated like breathing, and she watched the dancers turn in their practiced circles, while she remained motionless at the edge of the room, a pale figure against the dark velvet curtains, wondering if Frederick would find her, or if tonight would be the night he finally realized that his attention to her had been a mistake that society would not allow him to forget. She had seen him earlier, surrounded by the glittering press of eligible young ladies and their determined mammas. And she had retreated to this corner rather than watch Lady Georgiana Sinclair place her elegant gloved hand upon his arm with the proprietary confidence of a woman who knew she belonged in his world in ways that Eleanor never could. The gossip had grown sharper in the 3 days since their walk in Hyde Park, the whispers no longer merely curious, but edged with something cruel, and Eleanor had heard enough fragments to understand that society had rendered its judgment upon her presumption. "She is quite plain," Lady Sinclair's voice carried clearly from behind a nearby pillar, the speaker apparently unaware or uncaring that Eleanor stood within earshot, and one must wonder what arts she has employed to capture his attention, for surely the Duke cannot be so blind as to prefer that mousy spinster to women of genuine beauty and accomplishment. The laughter that followed was delicate and devastating, and Eleanor felt each note strike against her heart like a physical blow, felt the familiar shame rise in her throat with a bitterness she had thought she had learned to swallow years ago. She turned to leave, to find some quiet corner where she could compose herself before anyone noticed the brightness gathering in her eyes, and found herself face to face with Frederick, whose grey eyes held a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into something almost frightening. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carefully controlled but vibrating with suppressed anger, "would you do me the honour of taking some air on the terrace?" And Eleanor could only nod and allow him to guide her through the doors into the cool darkness of the April night, where the sounds of the ball became muffled and distant, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns of indifference. "I heard what she said," Frederick told her quietly when they stood alone among the shadows and the scent of early roses, and Eleanor felt her face flush with humiliation that he had witnessed her degradation, but when she tried to speak, he raised his hand to silence her. "What Lady Sinclair thinks of you matters nothing to me," he continued, his voice fierce and tender at once, "and I would have you know that her cruelty reflects only upon her own character, never upon yours, for you possess more worth in your smallest gesture than she holds in her entire glittering existence." Eleanor looked up at him in the moonlight, at this man who defended her honour when she had long since stopped believing it worth defending, and felt the walls around her heart crack and shift like ice beginning to thaw beneath an unexpected spring sun. The afternoon of April 30th brought Frederick to the door of Lady Whitmore's residence at precisely 2 o'clock, and Eleanor stood in the drawing-room with her hands clasped tightly before her, watching through the window as his carriage drew up to the curb and feeling her heart perform the most alarming acrobatics within her chest, for she understood with perfect clarity that a formal call at her residence meant something, entirely different from chance encounters at balls and galleries and parks, understood that he was declaring his intentions to her household and to anyone who might observe his arrival, and the knowledge filled her with a joy so sharp it was nearly indistinguishable from terror. The drawing-room had been aired and arranged with particular care that morning, Aunt Harriet having received word of the Duke's intended visit through channels Eleanor did not care to examine too closely, and the furniture gleamed with fresh polish while the curtains had been drawn back to admit the pale spring sunshine that fell in gentle patterns across the Aubusson carpet and illuminated the delicate china of the tea service that waited upon the sideboard. When the butler announced him, Eleanor felt the breath leave her body entirely, and she could only watch as Frederick entered the room carrying a bouquet of white roses so perfect they seemed carved from snow and moonlight, their petals unfurling in layers of creamy luminescence that caught the light and held it like captured secrets. "Your Grace," Aunt Harriet said with a warmth that surprised Eleanor, given her aunt's typically acerbic manner, "how very good of you to call upon us." And Eleanor noticed how her aunt's sharp eyes assessed every detail of Frederick's appearance, from the impeccable cut of his dark blue coat to the simple elegance of his cravat, to the genuine warmth that softened his usually stern features when his gaze found Eleanor standing by the window. "These are for you, Miss Ashworth," he said, crossing the room to present the roses. And when their fingers brushed during the exchange, Eleanor felt the contact like lightning along her nerves, a sensation made more intense by the knowledge that her aunt watched every moment with the keen attention of a general surveying a battlefield. The conversation that followed was conducted according to the strictest proprieties, with Aunt Harriet asking questions about his estate and his travels, while Eleanor poured tea with hands that trembled only slightly and offered observations about the weather and the latest exhibitions with a composure she did not feel. Yet beneath the surface of proper discourse ran a current of unspoken communication, glances that lingered a heartbeat too long, a smile that Frederick directed at her when her aunt looked away, a moment when he spoke of the gardens at Somerton Park, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that suggested he was seeing her there, walking those paths beside him, belonging to that world as his equal rather than as an overlooked companion in borrowed gowns. When he departed an hour later, Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage disappear around the corner while the white roses filled the room with their delicate fragrance, and Aunt Harriet's voice broke through her reverie with uncharacteristic gentleness. "He means to have you, my dear," her aunt said quietly, and Eleanor pressed her fingers against the cool glass and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long years, to believe that happiness might not be merely a dream from which she would inevitably wake. Lord Greville's townhouse on the evening of May the 5th glowed with the warm amber light of beeswax candles that cast flattering shadows across the intimate dining room where only 8 guests had gathered around a table laid with fine porcelain and crystal that caught the flames and scattered them like scattered diamonds across the damask cloth. And Eleanor sat in her green silk gown, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember that she might actually belong somewhere, that the laughter rising in her throat need not be swallowed and suppressed, but could be released into the air, where it mingled with the conversation that flowed as freely as the excellent wine Lord Greville kept pouring into glasses that never seemed to empty. The company was select and unpretentious, friends of Frederick's from his years abroad, and their wives, people who cared nothing for the rigid hierarchies of London society and everything for wit and warmth and genuine connection. And Eleanor found herself drawn into discussions of philosophy and literature and politics with an ease that would have been impossible in the glittering ballrooms where every word was weighed and measured for its potential to damage or elevate. Frederick sat across from her rather than beside her, a deliberate choice that allowed him to watch her face as she spoke, and Eleanor felt his gaze upon her like sunlight, warming places within her that had been cold for so very long, felt herself unfurling beneath his attention like a flower that had forgotten it knew how to bloom. She made an observation about the novel they were discussing, something about the author's treatment of female agency, that she would never have dared to voice in other company. And the table fell briefly silent before Lord Greville burst into appreciative laughter and declared that Frederick had described her perfectly. Later, when the ladies had withdrawn to the drawing-room and Eleanor stood by the window looking out at the lamplit street below, Lord Greville appeared beside her with the easy manner of a man who had known Frederick since their schooldays and felt entitled to speak plainly on matters of the heart. "He speaks of you constantly, you know," Greville said quietly, his jovial face unusually serious in the candlelight. "And I have never seen him thus in all the years of our friendship, for Frederick has always held himself apart, protected himself against connection after what his family put him through. But with you he is different. With you he allows himself to hope." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to cry in front of this kind man who was offering her a gift beyond price. The knowledge that Frederick's regard was not merely politeness or passing fancy, but something deeper and more enduring than she had dared to believe. When Frederick entered the room moments later, and his eyes found hers immediately across the crowded space, when his rare smile broke across his face like dawn breaking over distant hills, Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble and knew with terrifying certainty that she had given him her heart completely, that whatever came next, she would face it not as the invisible woman she had trained herself to be, but as someone who had finally remembered that she deserved to be seen. The afternoon of May 10th unfolded in golden light that spilled across the Whitmore garden like honey poured from a generous hand, and Eleanor walked beside Frederick along the gravel paths that wound between beds where roses waited in tight, furled buds for the warmth that would coax them into bloom, and she felt happiness radiating through her body like something physical, something she could almost touch, a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine, and everything to do with the man whose arm occasionally brushed against hers as they walked, and whose voice wrapped around her like velvet when he spoke of Somerton Park, and the gardens there that his mother had planted before her death, and that he had neglected during his years abroad, but wished now to restore to their former glory. "I should like to show them to you," he said quietly, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that neither acknowledged directly, but both understood completely. The implication that she would visit his estate, that she would walk those paths as something more than a guest, that he was speaking of a future in which she belonged there beside him. Eleanor felt her heart stutter, and then race forward like a horse given its head, and she could not bring herself to look at him directly, for fear that he would see everything written upon her face, the love she could no longer deny, the hope she could no longer suppress, the terror that still lurked beneath, the joy whispering that this could not last, that she did not deserve such happiness, that something would come to tear it away. They paused beside the old stone bench where Eleanor had spent countless hours reading during the 3 years of her residence with her aunt, and Frederick gestured for her to sit while he remained standing, looking down at her with an expression so tender it made her eyes sting with unshed tears. A strand of hair had loosened from her simple arrangement and drifted across her cheek in the light breeze, and before she could reach up to tuck it away, Frederick's hand was there, his fingers brushing against her skin as he gently guided the errant lock back behind her ear, and Eleanor forgot how to breathe entirely as his touch lingered for a moment longer than necessity required, his fingertips trailing along the curve of her jaw before withdrawing with obvious reluctance. His signet ring caught the sunlight as he lowered his hand, the Ravenscroft crest gleaming gold, against his finger, and Eleanor thought of what it would mean to bear that name, to be his Duchess, to wake each morning beside this man who had somehow seen past her plainness and her poverty and her carefully constructed invisibility to the woman she truly was beneath. A thrush sang somewhere in the hedgerow, and the breeze carried the scent of warming earth and growing things. And Frederick sat down beside her on the bench closer than propriety strictly allowed, and Eleanor let herself lean almost imperceptibly toward his warmth, let herself believe for one perfect golden afternoon that she might actually be allowed to keep this impossible gift that fate had placed before her. The morning of May 12th arrived wrapped in pale golden light that filtered through the thin curtains of Eleanor's modest bedroom and fell across her face where she lay, tangled in sheets, dampened by the night terrors that had plagued her sleep, dreams in which Frederick's tender expression transformed into disgust, in which his hand withdrew from hers, and he turned away just as Marcus Chamberlain had turned away 3 years ago, in that moonlit garden where she had believed herself loved and discovered herself ruined instead. She sat up slowly, pressing her palms against her eyes as if she could push the memories back into the locked chambers of her mind, where she had kept them imprisoned for so long. But they would not be contained this morning, not when happiness stood so close she could almost touch it, not when the spectre of her past seemed to sense her vulnerability and rose up to remind her of everything she had tried so desperately to forget. The room around her was simple, befitting her station as a dependent relation rather than a daughter of the house, the furniture well-made but unfashionable, the rug worn thin in patches, the mirror above the washstand small and spotted with age, and Eleanor had never minded these humble surroundings until now, until Frederick had spoken of Somerton Park, and gardens that needed restoration, and a future that shimmered before her like a mirage she feared would dissolve if she reached for it too eagerly. A knock at her door made her heart leap, and Mary entered, bearing a silver tray upon which rested a letter sealed with red wax pressed with a crest. Eleanor now knew as well as her own name, the Ravenscroft arms that Frederick wore upon his signet ring, and her fingers trembled as she took the folded paper and broke the seal to reveal his elegant hand requesting the honor of a private audience that afternoon. Words so formal yet somehow intimate, so correct yet somehow burning with meaning, that made her cheeks flush and her pulse quicken unbearably. She pressed the letter to her chest and allowed herself one moment of pure joy before the shadows crept back in, before the voice that sounded like Marcus whispered that she was fooling herself, that Frederick did not know what she truly was, that when he discovered the truth of that terrible night when she had been lured to the garden and found herself alone with a man whose intentions were far from honorable, when he learned that she had been discovered in Marcus's arms by a gossiping matron who spread the tale before Eleanor could even understand what had happened, he would look at her with the same contempt that society had shown her ever since. She rose and moved to the window where the morning light illuminated the white roses Frederick had sent, still fresh in their vase upon her small writing desk, and she allowed herself to hope despite everything, allowed herself to believe that perhaps this man who saw her when no one else did might also see past the stain upon her reputation to the woman she truly was beneath. The afternoon of May 13th dawned bright and warm as Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom and examined her reflection with eyes that hardly recognized the woman gazing back at her, for she had chosen to wear white today, a gown of delicate muslin trimmed with pale ribbon that her aunt had pressed upon her weeks ago and that she had refused until this morning when hope had finally won its battle against fear and she had allowed herself to dress as a woman who believed she might be loved, a woman who dared to imagine that this afternoon Frederick might speak the words that would transform her life forever. The carriage ride to Lady Beaumont's garden party passed in a blur of nervous anticipation, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart beating so rapidly she felt certain her aunt must hear it above the clatter of hooves upon cobblestones. And when they arrived at the sprawling estate with its manicured lawns and flowering hedges, she stepped down onto the gravel drive, feeling as though she walked through a dream from which she prayed she would never wake. She saw Frederick almost immediately, his tall figure unmistakable among the clusters of guests, and when his eyes found hers across the distance, his expression softened into that rare, tender smile that seemed reserved for her alone, and Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long, grey winter. She moved through the crowd toward him, accepting greetings from acquaintances who seemed to look at her differently now, with curiosity and perhaps grudging respect. And she was mere steps from reaching Frederick's side when a voice behind her froze the blood in her veins and turned the warm spring afternoon into something cold and terrible. "Eleanor, what an unexpected pleasure!" the voice drawled with silken cruelty, and she turned slowly, her body knowing before her mind could accept what her eyes would confirm. And there stood Marcus Chamberlain exactly as she remembered him from her nightmares, handsome as a fallen angel with golden hair and eyes the pale blue of winter ice, his smile sharp enough to cut, and the 3 years since she had last seen him collapsed into nothing as every carefully constructed wall inside her crumbled to dust. He looked prosperous and pleased with himself, this man who had courted her with pretty words and stolen kisses, who had lured her into a moonlit garden with promises of eternal devotion, who had arranged for them to be discovered in an embrace she had not initiated by a matron whose tongue wagged faster than her feet could carry her, who had then denied everything and left Eleanor to face the scandal alone, while he disappeared to the continent with his reputation intact and hers in tatters. She could not move, could not speak, could not do anything but stand there in her hopeful white dress while the ghost of her past smiled at her with teeth like a wolf. And somewhere behind her she heard Frederick call her name, but the sound reached her as if through deep water, muffled and distant, and all she could see was Marcus, and all she could feel was the familiar, crushing weight of shame descending upon her once more. Frederick had been drawn away by Lord Greville mere moments before Marcus appeared, called to greet some acquaintance whose name Eleanor could not now recall, and in his absence she found herself alone with the man who had destroyed her life, standing beside the marble fountain whose gentle spray did nothing to cool the feverish terror burning through her veins as Marcus stepped closer with that predatory grace she remembered from 3 years ago when she had been foolish enough to mistake it for elegance. "You look well, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice pitched low so that no one passing by would hear anything but pleasant conversation between old acquaintances, though his pale eyes glittered with malice that made her stomach clench with remembered fear. "I had heard you were being courted by Somerton, and I confess I did not believe it, for who would have thought that the little mouse I left trembling in that garden would somehow catch the attention of a duke? But then I suppose desperate men make desperate choices, and perhaps he does not know what you truly are." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run across the manicured lawns and never stop running until she had left London and society and Marcus Chamberlain far behind her. But she had learned in the years since her ruin that showing weakness only invited further cruelty. So she lifted her chin and said nothing, even as her hands shook inside her white gloves. His smile widened at her silence, taking it for the fear it was rather than the defiance she wished it could be, and he leaned closer until she could smell his cologne, that same sandalwood scent that had once made her heart race with innocent anticipation, and now made bile rise in her throat with remembered shame. "I wonder what Somerton would think if he knew," Marcus continued in that same soft, terrible voice. "If he understood that the woman he has been parading about London was found in my arms in a moonlit garden, dishevelled and compromised, that all of society whispered about her wanton behaviour for months afterward. I wonder if he would still look at you with such tender regard, or if he would see you as everyone else does, as damaged goods, as a woman no honourable man should touch." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to give him that satisfaction, and she was searching for words to respond when she heard Frederick's voice calling her name, and saw him striding toward them across the grass with an expression she had never seen before, his dark eyes sharp with concern and something fiercer beneath. And Marcus stepped back smoothly and sketched an ironic bow before melting away into the crowd of guests as if he had never been there at all, leaving Eleanor standing alone by the fountain with her white dress bright against the green hedges and her heart shattered into pieces at her feet. Frederick reached her side and took her trembling hand in his, asking what was wrong, who that man was, why she looked as though she had seen a ghost. But Eleanor could not answer him, could not find the words to explain the magnitude of what Marcus's return meant. So she simply shook her head and whispered that it was nothing, an old acquaintance, nothing of importance, and watched Frederick's eyes narrow with disbelief as he clearly understood that she was lying to him for the first time since they had met. The evening of May 14th found Eleanor alone in her bedroom as rain streaked the windows and candles flickered in their holders, casting wavering shadows across the walls of the modest chamber that had been her refuge for 3 years. And she sat at her small writing desk with a sheet of paper before her and a pen in her trembling hand, trying to find the words that would end everything she had dared to dream might be hers, trying to compose the letter that would send Frederick away forever and spare him the scandal that Marcus Chamberlain would surely unleash upon them both if she did not act first to sever the connection that had become more precious to her than breath itself. The white roses Frederick had brought on his first formal call stood in a vase at the corner of her desk, their petals beginning to brown and curl at the edges, and she stared at them as memories she had kept locked away for 3 years came flooding back with a force that made her chest ache and her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. She remembered how Marcus had appeared in her life during her first and only season, how his golden handsomeness and charming attention had dazzled a naive girl of 23 who had never been courted before, who had believed herself too plain and too poor to attract anyone of consequence, and who had therefore been utterly unprepared for the siege. He laid to her innocent heart with his pretty compliments and stolen glances and whispered promises of devotion. She remembered the moonlit garden at Lady Thornton's ball, how he had led her, outside with talk of needing fresh air, how his kisses had confused and frightened her, even as some part of her had thrilled at being wanted, how she had tried to pull away when his hands grew too bold and his breath too urgent, and how the garden gate had opened at precisely that moment to reveal Mrs. Langley and 2 other matrons whose gasps of horror still echoed in her nightmares. She remembered Marcus stepping away from her with practiced smoothness, his expression shifting from passion to cold disdain in the space of a heartbeat, remembered him saying that she had thrown herself at him and he had merely been trying to extricate himself from her embarrassing advances, remembered the matrons believing him because he was handsome and titled and she was nobody, remembered the weeks of whispers and cut acquaintances and her mother weeping and her father's silent disappointment before his death that winter, remembered Marcus leaving for the continent without a backward glance while she retreated to Aunt Harriet's household and learned to make herself invisible and unremarkable, learned to expect nothing and want nothing and hope for nothing because hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. And now she had committed the unforgivable sin of hoping again, of believing that Frederick's attention might be real and lasting, and Marcus had returned to remind her that ruined women did not get happy endings, that the stain on her reputation would spread to anyone foolish enough to ally himself with her, and she loved Frederick too much to let him sacrifice his good name for her sake. The pen scratched against paper as she began to write, each word a small death, each sentence a piece of her heart torn away and laid upon the page. The morning of May 15th dawned grey and cold, the rain of the previous night having given way to a heavy mist that clung to the windows of Aunt Harriet's townhouse and seemed to Eleanor like a physical manifestation of the fog that had settled over her heart, and she descended to the drawing-room at 10 in the morning, wearing a simple grey dress that matched her mood and carrying the letter she had finally completed in the small hours before dawn, the letter that would end everything, that would send Frederick away before Marcus could destroy them both. And she had just seated herself on the settee and was steeling herself to summon a footman to deliver her carefully worded rejection when the butler appeared in the doorway and announced that the Duke of Somerton had arrived and was requesting to see her, and before Eleanor could gather her wits to refuse him, before she could compose her features into the cold mask she had practiced in her mirror, Frederick strode into the room with a determined energy she had never seen in him before, his dark hair slightly dishevelled as though he had dressed in haste, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch, even as her heart shattered at the knowledge of what she must do, and he crossed the room in 4 long strides and took the chair across from her without waiting for invitation, his gaze searching her face with an urgency that made her want to weep. "You did not sleep," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of concern that pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. "You have been crying, and you look as though you carry the weight of the world upon your shoulders. And I know why, Eleanor. I know everything." She felt the blood drain from her face at his words, felt the room spin slightly as she gripped the arm of the settee to steady herself, and she opened her mouth to deliver the speech she had rehearsed, the careful words about incompatibility and different expectations, and the inadvisability of continuing their acquaintance, but Frederick leaned forward and spoke before she could begin. "I spent yesterday making inquiries," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I learned about Viscount Chamberlain and what he did to you 3 years ago. I learned about the garden, and the witnesses, and the lies he told to save his own reputation at the cost of yours. I learned how society punished you for his cruelty, and how you have spent the years since making yourself invisible to survive. And I am here to tell you that none of it matters to me. Not one single whispered word of it." Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her determination to remain composed, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper as she said, "He did not understand. That Marcus would tell everyone, that Frederick's good name would be tarnished by association with her, that she could not bear to be the cause of his ruin after he had shown her such kindness." And she held out the letter with trembling fingers, begging him to read it and accept her decision, to walk away while he still could, and find someone worthy of a duke, someone whose past was not stained with scandal and shame. Frederick did not take the letter from her outstretched hand, but instead rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, and before Eleanor could comprehend what was happening, he had lowered himself to one knee before her, his dark eyes never leaving her face as he gently took both of her trembling hands in his own and held them with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat, and fresh tears spill down her cheeks. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, yet steady with absolute conviction, as he said that she had spent 3 years believing herself ruined and unworthy. 3 years hiding her light and her wit and her extraordinary heart from a world that did not deserve her, and he refused to let her spend one more day in that darkness, refused to let the cruelty of one worthless man and the shallow judgment of society rob them both of the happiness they had found in each other. And then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a ring that caught the pale morning light filtering through the windows. A delicate band of gold set with a single sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, and he told her it had been his mother's, that she had worn it every day of her marriage, and had made him promise to give it only to a woman who possessed both intelligence and kindness in equal measure, a woman who would be his partner and his equal and his truest friend. And he had despaired of ever finding such a woman until he walked into a library seeking escape from a tedious ball and discovered her sitting alone with a book, utterly uninterested in impressing anyone, utterly herself. And he had known even then that she was different from every other woman he had ever met. Eleanor tried to speak, tried to protest that he was throwing away his future on damaged goods, that Marcus would spread his poison and society would turn against them both. But Frederick shook his head and said that society could hang for all he cared, that he had spent 5 years abroad precisely because he could not stomach the shallow cruelty and petty machinations of the ton, and the only reason he had returned was duty to his title. But she had given him a reason to stay that had nothing to do with duty, and everything to do with the way his heart lifted when she entered a room, the way her laugh made the world seem brighter, the way her mind challenged and delighted him in equal measure. And he would face any scandal, weather any storm, endure any whispered gossip if it meant he could wake every morning knowing she was his wife. He slid the ring onto her finger before she could object further, and it fit as though it had been made for her. And then he rose and cupped her tear-streaked face in his hands and kissed her with a gentleness that broke through every wall she had built around her wounded heart. A kiss that tasted of salt and promise and hope reborn, and against his lips she whispered, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes," and felt for the first time in 3 long years that she might actually deserve to be happy. The hours that followed Eleanor's acceptance passed in a blur of joy and urgent planning, for Frederick had taken her hands in his and spoken words that changed everything when he said he would not wait, could not wait, refused to give Marcus Chamberlain or anyone else the opportunity to poison what they had found. And when Eleanor looked at him with confusion clouding her tear-bright eyes, he explained that he had already procured a special license, had obtained it 3 days prior when he first realized the depth of his feelings and the certainty of his intentions. And he asked her now, with fierce tenderness in his voice, if she would marry him not in weeks or months but tomorrow, this very morning, if she would have him. And Eleanor felt her heart stop and restart in a new rhythm as she understood what he was offering, not just marriage, but protection, not just love, but a shield against every cruel whisper and cutting glance that Marcus might unleash. And she said yes again, yes to everything, yes to him. And by noon, Aunt Harriet had returned to find her drawing-room transformed into a whirlwind of activity as Frederick explained his intentions, and Eleanor stood beside him, wearing his mother's ring and a smile she could not contain. And though Aunt Harriet sputtered at first about propriety and proper announcements and wedding breakfasts, she fell silent when Frederick told her quietly that Eleanor's happiness and safety were more important than any social nicety, and something in his tone, or perhaps in the protective way he held Eleanor's hand, made the older woman nod slowly and then begin issuing orders to the household staff with military precision, and by evening a simple cream-colored gown had been altered and pressed, flowers had been ordered, and arrangements had been made with the small chapel where Frederick's family had worshipped for generations. And Eleanor lay awake through the night, not from fear, but from wonder, watching the moonlight play across the sapphire ring on her finger and marveling at how quickly everything had changed, how the woman who had woken that morning prepared to sacrifice her own heart was now mere hours from becoming a duchess. And when dawn broke pale and golden on May 16, 1814, Eleanor rose and dressed with trembling hands, and Aunt Harriet appeared with tears in her eyes to help arrange her hair and fasten the delicate strand of pearls that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. And at 8:30 in the morning, Eleanor walked into the candle-lit chapel on her aunt's arm and saw Frederick waiting at the altar with Lord Greville beside him. And the look on Frederick's face as she approached, the naked adoration and relief and joy that transformed his usually guarded features, told her more clearly than any words that she had made the right choice. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Frederick kissed her with reverent tenderness, Eleanor Ashworth became Eleanor Ravenscroft, Duchess of Somerton, and she understood finally that she had not been rescued, but rather recognized, seen and valued and chosen by a man who loved her precisely as she was. The news spread through London society like wildfire through dry brush, whispers racing from drawing-room to drawing-room and gathering momentum with each retelling, and by the afternoon of May 16th, every hostess and gossip and curious onlooker knew that the Duke of Somerton had married Miss Eleanor Ashworth in a private ceremony that morning, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to grudging admiration, depending on who was speaking and who was listening. But nowhere was the news received with more fury than in the elegant townhouse where Viscount Marcus Chamberlain had taken up residence upon his return to town, for he had planned his campaign of destruction with meticulous care, and had intended to reveal Eleanor's shame at the very moment it would cause maximum damage, perhaps at a ball where she stood beside the Duke expecting a proposal, perhaps through carefully placed whispers that would reach Frederick's ears and poison his regard. But instead, he found himself outmaneuvered by a man who had simply refused to play by society's rules, and the rage that twisted Marcus's handsome features when his valet brought him the news would have frightened anyone who witnessed it, though he was careful to smooth his expression into something resembling amused contempt before he ventured out that evening to Lady Pemberton's ball, where all of society had gathered to dissect the scandal of the season. And it was there, in the glittering ballroom, packed with curious faces and wagging tongues, that Eleanor made her first public appearance as the Duchess of Somerton, walking in on Frederick's arm wearing a gown of deep blue silk that his aunt had sent over that afternoon, along with a note of welcome to the family. And the sapphire ring on her finger caught the candlelight as Frederick led her through the parting crowd with his head held high and his hand pressed warmly over hers where it rested on his arm. And Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, felt the whispers like a physical pressure against her skin, but she also felt Frederick's steady presence beside her, and drew courage from his unwavering calm. And when Lady Pemberton herself approached to offer congratulations, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, Frederick thanked her with perfect courtesy, while making it abundantly clear through his posture and his tone that any slight to his wife would be considered a slight to himself, and gradually the room began to adjust to this new reality, began to calculate the social mathematics of offending one of the most powerful dukes in England versus the pleasure of cutting a woman they had dismissed as a spinster, and one by one the calculations came out in Eleanor's favour, though she knew the whispers would continue in private, and the cut direct would come from those bold enough to risk Frederick's displeasure. But standing there in that glittering ballroom with her husband's ring on her finger and his love wrapped around her heart, she found she did not care what any of them thought, because she had already won the only battle that mattered. The ballroom had begun to feel almost bearable, the whispers fading to a dull hum beneath the music, and the warmth of Frederick's presence at her side, when Eleanor saw him cutting through the crowd with the deliberate grace of a predator who had finally spotted wounded prey, and her heart seized in her chest as Marcus Chamberlain approached with that smile she remembered so well, the one that had once made her believe herself loved, and now made her blood run cold. And Frederick felt her stiffen beside him, and turned to follow her gaze, just as Marcus stopped before them and executed a bow so perfect it bordered on mockery, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the eager ears of nearby guests as he said, "How delightful to see you again, Miss Ashworth, though I suppose I should say, Your Grace, now. What a remarkable elevation for a woman of your particular history." And the emphasis he placed on those last words sent a ripple of excited whispers through the surrounding crowd, and Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility crumbled in an instant. But before she could speak, or flee, or shatter entirely, Frederick stepped forward with a movement so controlled and dangerous that Marcus actually retreated half a step, and when Frederick spoke, his voice was pitched to carry across the suddenly silent ballroom, as he said, "I find it curious, Chamberlain, that you speak of history when your own is so remarkably sordid, or did you think I would not learn of your debts in Italy, your hasty departure from Vienna, the young widow in Paris whose brother still seeks satisfaction?" And Marcus's face went pale beneath his practiced charm as Frederick continued with lethal precision. "My wife's history, as you call it, consists of being targeted by a coward who engineered her compromise and then fled rather than face the consequences of his own actions." And the word wife rang through the ballroom like a bell, and Marcus recovered enough to sneer and say, "Nobody will marry a ruined woman," to which Frederick replied with ice in every syllable, "I already did this morning." And the collective gasp that swept through Lady Pemberton's ballroom was loud enough to momentarily drown the orchestra, and Eleanor watched as understanding dawned across dozens of faces, watched the social calculations shift in real time as the assembled guests recognized that the Duke of Somerton had not merely married a woman of questionable reputation, but had done so knowing everything and choosing her anyway. And Marcus stood exposed before them all, not as the charming rake who had nearly ruined an innocent girl, but as the villain of a story that had somehow ended in triumph. And when Frederick turned to Eleanor and lifted her gloved hand to his lips with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unshed tears, she understood that he had not merely defended her honor, but had rewritten the narrative entirely, transforming her from a woman who had been ruined into a woman who had been wronged, and was now magnificently, publicly, irrevocably vindicated. The aftermath of Frederick's declaration rippled outward through the ballroom like stones cast into still water, and Eleanor watched as Marcus Chamberlain stood frozen in the wreckage of his carefully constructed revenge, his handsome face twisted with an ugly blend of fury and disbelief that stripped away every pretense of charm and revealed the cruel emptiness beneath. And for one long moment, nobody moved or spoke, as the orchestra faltered into silence, and hundreds of eyes darted between the disgraced Viscount and the Duke, who had just demolished him with nothing more than truth and unwavering love. And then Lord Greville stepped forward from the crowd with his jovial face set in uncharacteristic coldness and said, "I believe you were just leaving, Chamberlain," and the words broke whatever spell had held the room suspended, and Marcus turned on his heel and strode toward the doors with what dignity he could salvage, while whispers erupted in his wake like flames consuming dry kindling, and Eleanor felt her knees begin to tremble as the tension that had held her upright suddenly released. But Frederick was there with his arm sliding around her waist to steady her, his voice low and warm against her ear as he murmured, "You are extraordinary, and I am the most fortunate man in England." And she wanted to laugh and cry, and perhaps faint all at once, but instead she simply leaned into his strength and let herself be held before the watching world. And Lady Pemberton approached again, with considerably more warmth in her smile. This time to offer the Duke and Duchess the use of her private parlour if they wished to escape the crush, and Frederick accepted with grave courtesy, and guided Eleanor through the parting crowd and into a small, elegant room where a fire burned low and comfortable chairs waited in the golden light. And the moment the door closed behind them, Eleanor felt the tears she had been suppressing finally break free, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and joy and the strange grief that comes from finally releasing a burden carried so long it had become part of her very bones. And Frederick gathered her against his chest and held her while she wept, his hand stroking her hair, and his voice murmuring words of love and comfort and fierce pride. And when at last the storm passed, and she lifted her face to look at him with red-rimmed eyes and a tremulous smile, he cupped her face in his hands and said, "You never have to be invisible again, and you never have to be afraid again. Because I will spend the rest of my life making certain the world sees you as I do." And Eleanor reached up to cover his hands with her own and whispered, "I love you, Frederick Ravenscroft, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that love." And he shook his head with that rare smile that transformed his stern features and said, "You already are, and you always were." And when he kissed her this time, it was not the gentle, reverent kiss of their first embrace, but something deeper and more passionate, a promise sealed in firelight, while the ballroom buzzed with scandal beyond the door. The days that followed Lady Pemberton's ball unfolded like pages from a story Eleanor had never dared to imagine for herself, and she found herself moving through them with a sense of wonder that bordered on disbelief, as society's treatment of her transformed so completely it seemed almost theatrical in its reversal. Where once she had been invisible or pitied or mocked, she now found herself the subject of fascinated admiration and eager attention, hostesses who had never troubled to learn. Her name now sent effusive invitations addressed to Her Grace the Duchess of Somerton, and young ladies who had once looked through her as though she were made of glass now sought her company with flattering persistence, eager to hear the romantic tale of how the reclusive Duke had fallen so completely for the quiet companion that he had married her in secret to protect her honor. Frederick watched these transformations with a sardonic amusement that made Eleanor laugh despite herself. His dry observations about society's fickleness whispered in her ear during the endless round of calls and entertainments that now filled their days, and she found herself growing stronger in his presence, more confident, more willing to claim the space she had spent so many years trying not to occupy. Aunt Harriet had wept with joy upon learning of the marriage, and had immediately begun planning a grand celebration to formally introduce the new Duchess to society, and Eleanor had let herself be swept along by her aunt's enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction and the genuine happiness that radiated from the woman who had sheltered her through the darkest years. Lord Greville had become a frequent visitor, his warm presence a welcome counterpoint to the sometimes overwhelming attention of the ton, and Eleanor discovered in him a true friend, who seemed as delighted by Frederick's happiness as she was. The white roses Frederick had brought her that first formal call now bloomed in profusion throughout the Whitmore house, and Eleanor had taken to wearing one tucked into her hair each morning, a small symbol of the love that had grown from such unlikely soil. She spent hours learning about Frederick's estate in the country, poring over his descriptions of rolling hills and ancient oaks, and a library that made her heart race with anticipation, and they made plans to retreat there once the season ended, to begin their life together away from the glittering fishbowl of London society. But it was in the quiet moments that Eleanor felt the full weight of her transformation, in the mornings when she woke to find Frederick already watching her with that look of tender wonder that still made her blush, in the evenings when they sat together reading by the fire, and his hand found hers without either of them looking up from their books, in the stolen kisses that grew bolder and more passionate as the days passed and the formal celebration of their union drew near. She was no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, no longer the woman society had dismissed as ruined and worthless, and though she knew she owed none of her worth to their belated recognition, there was a sweetness in being seen at last. The formal celebration of their union arrived on a golden afternoon in late May, and Aunt Harriet's townhouse had been transformed into a bower of white roses and trailing greenery that filled every room with sweetness and light, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chambers, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been made specially for this occasion, its delicate embroidery catching the sunlight that streamed through the windows, and she barely recognized the woman who gazed back at her with bright eyes and flushed cheeks and an expression of such unguarded happiness that it seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone who had never learned to make herself small and silent and invisible. Frederick had insisted that no expense be spared, and though Eleanor had protested that such extravagance was unnecessary, she had secretly delighted in every detail, from the towering arrangements of flowers to the orchestra that would play in the ballroom to the menu that featured all her favorite dishes, and she understood that this celebration was not merely about announcing their marriage to society, but about declaring to the world that she was worthy of being celebrated, that she had always been worthy even when no one else could see it. Aunt Harriet appeared in the doorway with tears already glistening in her sharp old eyes and pronounced Eleanor the most beautiful bride she had ever seen, and though Eleanor laughed and called her aunt a sentimental fool, she felt the words settle into her heart like seeds taking root in fertile soil. The guests began arriving at 4 in the afternoon, a glittering parade of society's finest, who had suddenly discovered a pressing desire to pay their respects to the new Duchess of Somerton, and Eleanor received them in the drawing-room, with Frederick standing solid and warm beside her, his hand finding hers between greetings, his eyes meeting hers with private amusement at the parade of flattery and fawning that neither of them had any use for. Lord Greville served as unofficial master of ceremonies, his jovial presence smoothing over any awkward moments and ensuring that the champagne flowed freely and the conversation never flagged, and Eleanor found herself genuinely laughing at his wit and warmth, grateful beyond measure for the friendship he had extended to her without reservation. Lady Georgiana Sinclair arrived in a stunning gown of pale pink that would have outshone any other woman present, but she approached Eleanor with something that looked almost like genuine respect in her cool blue eyes and offered congratulations that seemed, for once, to carry no hidden barb, and Eleanor accepted them graciously and felt nothing but calm certainty in the face of the beauty who had once made her feel so inadequate. The ballroom glowed with hundreds of candles as evening fell, and when Frederick led Eleanor onto the floor for the first dance, the gathered guests fell silent to watch as the Duke of Somerton gazed at his unlikely Duchess with an expression of such open adoration that even the most cynical hearts could not help but be moved, and Eleanor let herself be swept away. The music swelled around them as they moved across the polished floor, and Eleanor felt as though she were floating, in Frederick's arms, the weight of all those years of invisibility and shame falling away with each graceful turn, and she looked up into his dark eyes and saw there a reflection of her own joy, her own wonder at the improbable path that had led them to this moment, and she thought that she would remember this night for the rest of her life, the candlelight and the roses and the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the knowledge that she belonged here, in his arms, in this glittering room, in this new life that stretched before them like an unwritten book full of blank pages waiting to be filled. When the dance ended and the applause of the guests washed over them like a warm tide, Frederick led her to the edge of the floor and pressed a kiss to her gloved hand that lingered just long enough to make her blush, and then they were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and compliments that would have seemed hollow just weeks ago, but now felt like the natural order of things, as though the world had finally righted itself after being tilted askew for so long. The evening passed in a blur of champagne and conversation and stolen glances across crowded rooms, and Eleanor found herself growing more comfortable in her new role with each passing hour, accepting congratulations with grace, deflecting intrusive questions with wit she had not known she possessed, and always aware of Frederick's presence nearby, his watchful eyes finding hers across the room, his subtle smile meant only for her. Lord Greville made a toast that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes and laughter to the crowd, speaking of Frederick's transformation from brooding recluse to besotted husband with such affectionate mockery that even Frederick smiled and raised his glass in acknowledgement, and Eleanor felt the warmth of true friendship surrounding her for the first time in years, felt herself becoming part of something larger than her own lonely existence. Aunt Harriet presided over the festivities like a queen holding court, her sharp tongue softened by genuine happiness, her eyes bright with satisfaction at having played her part in this most improbable of matches, and Eleanor caught her aunt's gaze across the room and mouthed a silent thank you that made the old woman's eyes glisten with unshed tears. As midnight approached and the candles burned low in their crystal holders, Frederick found Eleanor standing alone by the terrace doors, looking out at the moonlit garden where white roses gleamed like fallen stars in the darkness, and he came to stand beside her without speaking, his shoulder touching hers, his presence solid and warm and infinitely reassuring, and together they watched the night, and breathed in the sweet scent of flowers, and listened to the distant strains of music floating from the ballroom. And Eleanor thought that this was what happiness felt like, this quiet certainty, this peaceful joy, this knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant, to be with exactly the person she was meant to love. The days that followed the celebration passed in a golden haze of contentment that Eleanor had never imagined possible, and she found herself waking each morning with a sense of wonder that this was truly her life now, that the happiness she felt was not a dream from which she would soon be forced to wake. And Frederick seemed equally determined to savor every moment of their newfound joy, arranging small surprises and quiet pleasures that spoke more eloquently of his love than any grand gesture could have done. They spent long afternoons in the library of his London townhouse, reading aloud to each other from favorite volumes, debating the merits of various poets with a passionate intensity that often dissolved into laughter. And Eleanor discovered that marriage to Frederick was not the diminishment she had once feared, but rather an expansion, a flowering of possibilities she had long ago ceased to believe in. He listened to her opinions with genuine interest, challenged her thinking with respectful disagreement, and treated her mind as something worthy of engagement rather than something to be tolerated or ignored, and she felt herself growing stronger and more certain with each passing day, the timid companion who had hidden in corners at garden parties becoming someone she barely recognized. They began making plans to visit Somerton Park, Frederick's country estate, and he spoke of the grounds and the house and the tenants with such obvious love that Eleanor found herself eager to see this place that had shaped him, to walk the paths he had walked as a boy, to make her own memories in the rooms where generations of Ravenscrofts had lived and loved and died. Aunt Harriet visited frequently, her sharp tongue softened by satisfaction at the match she had helped facilitate, and she delighted in offering unsolicited advice about the management of a ducal household that Eleanor received with patient amusement, knowing that beneath her aunt's imperious manner lay genuine affection and concern. Lord Greville became a regular presence at their dinner table, his easy warmth and ready wit making him the perfect companion for quiet evenings at home, and Eleanor treasured his friendship as much as Frederick did, grateful for this man who had welcomed her without reservation into his closest circle. The town continued to buzz with gossip about the unlikely Duchess, but Eleanor found that she cared less with each passing day, secure in the knowledge that Frederick's love was not contingent on society's approval, that he had chosen her knowing full well what that choice would cost him in whispered speculation and raised eyebrows, and that he would make the same choice again without hesitation. She caught herself smiling at odd moments throughout the day, while arranging flowers in a vase, or selecting a book from the library shelves, or simply watching the play of afternoon light across the carpet. And she realized that this was what it meant to be happy. This quiet certainty, this peaceful joy, this sense of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love, and she offered up silent gratitude for the improbable series of events that had led her from resignation to hope to this extraordinary fulfillment. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet domesticity that Eleanor found more precious than all the glittering balls and grand entertainments that had once seemed so impossibly beyond her reach, and she discovered that happiness was not the dramatic crescendo she had imagined in her lonely years as a companion, but rather a gentle accumulation of small moments, morning tea shared in companionable silence, afternoon walks through the garden where roses now bloomed in fragrant profusion, evening conversations that ranged from philosophy to poetry to comfortable nonsense that made them both laugh until tears streamed down their faces. Frederick proved to be a husband of unexpected tenderness, attentive to her moods in ways that still surprised her, appearing at her elbow with a shawl when she shivered, remembering her preferences for certain books and certain flowers, and certain ways of taking her tea, and she found herself constantly marveling at this man who had chosen her, who continued to choose her every day with small acts of devotion that spoke louder than any declaration. They received word from Somerton Park that preparations were complete for their arrival, and Eleanor felt a flutter of nervous anticipation at the thought of seeing the estate that would become her home, the place where she would build a life with this man who had transformed her understanding of what love could be. Frederick spoke of the rolling hills and ancient oaks with such obvious affection that she found herself already loving a place she had never seen, already imagining herself walking those paths and sitting in those rooms and becoming part of the history that had shaped him. Aunt Harriet came to bid them farewell on the morning of their departure, her sharp eyes bright with emotion she would never openly acknowledge, and she pressed a small package into Eleanor's hands that contained a miniature portrait of Eleanor's mother, long thought lost, and Eleanor wept openly at this unexpected gift, while her aunt pretended great interest in examining the carriage wheels. The journey north took 3 days, and Eleanor watched the landscape change from London's crowded streets to gentle countryside to the wilder beauty of Frederick's home county, and with each mile she felt the last remnants of her old life falling away, the companion in grey gowns fading into memory, replaced by this woman she was still learning to recognize, this Duchess who laughed freely and loved deeply and dared to believe in her own worthiness. When the carriage finally crested the hill that revealed Somerton Park, spread below them in the golden light of late afternoon, Eleanor gasped at the beauty of it, the grand house of honey-colored stone, the sweeping lawns, the lake reflecting the sky like a mirror, and Frederick took her hand and squeezed it gently, and said simply, "Welcome home." And Eleanor felt something click into place inside her chest, a lock finally finding its key, a wanderer finally reaching the destination she had never known she was seeking, and she turned to look at her husband with tears in her eyes and joy in her heart. The first weeks at Somerton Park passed in a blur of discovery and delight, as Eleanor learned the rhythms of her new home, the grand house revealing its secrets gradually, like a beloved book read slowly to savor every page. And she found herself falling in love not just with the estate itself, but with the woman she was becoming within its walls, a woman who walked through magnificent rooms with quiet confidence, who spoke with tenants and servants as the Duchess she now was, who laughed freely in the gardens and debated politics over dinner and reached for her husband's hand without hesitation or apology. Frederick delighted in showing her every corner of the property, from the ancient oak where he had climbed as a boy to the library that rivaled any she had seen in London, and she watched him transform in this place, the reserved Duke she had first met in her aunt's library giving way to someone warmer and more open, someone whose rare smiles came more frequently now, someone who looked at her across the breakfast table each morning as though he still could not quite believe his good fortune. The staff welcomed her with a warmth that surprised her, having expected the cool assessment she had endured from London society, but the housekeeper Mrs. Bradley and the butler Mr. Thorne seemed genuinely pleased to have a mistress in residence again after so many years, and they deferred to her judgment with a respect that took some getting used to after a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed. Eleanor threw herself into learning the management of the household, discovering skills she had never known she possessed, an aptitude for organization and a genuine interest in the welfare of those who served them, and Frederick watched her growth with obvious pride, telling her one evening that she was exactly what Somerton Park had needed, exactly what he had needed, though he had not known it until he found her hiding in a library, trying to escape a ball. The summer stretched before them, golden and unhurried, days spent riding across the estate, and evenings spent reading aloud by the fire, nights spent in the intimacy of their shared chambers, where Eleanor discovered depths of passion she had never imagined possible, and she marveled at how completely her life had changed in the space of a few short months, how the woman who had resigned herself to invisibility and loneliness now found herself surrounded by love and purpose and belonging. Letters arrived regularly from London, from Aunt Harriet with her sharp observations and unsolicited advice, from Lord Greville with his cheerful gossip and promises to visit, and Eleanor answered each one with genuine pleasure, no longer dreading connection with the world beyond these walls, but welcoming it from the secure foundation of the life she and Frederick were building together, a life that proved every day that it was never too late for new beginnings, never too late to discover that one was worthy of love. Autumn arrived at Somerton Park with a gentle transformation that Eleanor watched unfold from her favorite window seat in the morning room, the leaves turning from verdant green to burnished gold and deep crimson, the air growing crisp with the promise of cooler days ahead, and she found herself marveling at how completely she had become part of this place in the months since her arrival, how the rhythms of the estate now felt as natural as breathing, how she could not imagine a life that did not include these rolling hills and ancient trees and the man who walked beside her through it all. Frederick had taken to reading aloud to her in the evenings, his deep voice wrapping around words of poetry and philosophy while she worked at her embroidery, or simply sat with her eyes closed, letting the sound wash over her like music. And these quiet hours became the cornerstone of their days together, a ritual of intimacy that required no grand gestures, only the simple pleasure of shared company and mutual understanding. The harvest brought increased activity to the estate, and Eleanor threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself, visiting tenant families with baskets of food and medicine, organizing the household staff to prepare for the winter months ahead, and discovering in these practical tasks a sense of purpose she had never known during her years as an overlooked companion in London drawing rooms. Frederick watched her growth with undisguised pride, telling her one evening as they walked through the orchard that she had brought something to Somerton Park that had been missing for years, a warmth and vitality that seemed to touch everyone who came within her sphere. And Eleanor had blushed at his words, even as her heart swelled with happiness she still sometimes struggled to believe she deserved. News arrived from London periodically, letters from Aunt Harriet filled with gossip and sharp observations about the Tons scandals and intrigues, and Eleanor read them aloud to Frederick over breakfast, both of them laughing at her aunt's acerbic wit and feeling grateful for the distance that separated them from that world of whispers and judgment and cruel assessments of human worth. Lord Greville wrote as well, his cheerful missives full of promises to visit before Christmas, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to welcoming guests to her home, to playing hostess in these grand rooms that had become so dear to her. As October gave way to November, and the first frost silvered the lawns, Eleanor began to suspect something that she hardly dared name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, a possibility so precious and terrifying that she held it close like a secret flame, waiting to be certain before she spoke the words that might change everything once again. And she found herself watching Frederick with new eyes, imagining him not just as husband but as father, not just as the man who had saved her from loneliness, but as the man with whom she would build a family, a legacy, a future that stretched beyond anything she had ever allowed herself to dream during those grey years of resignation and invisibility.